Hey, howdy, everyone. Nerd with the Beanie here. I am going to talk about a couple of sensitive topics today. Just a trigger warning for those of you who might be sensitive to eating disorders or body image. Um, this will be a topic of especially women's bodies. So, if it is a sensitive subject for you, I would just kindly ask, you know, if you need to step off and not watch this video, that is totally fine. It might be kind of obvious about who I'm going to talk about. I'm not putting any celebrity in particular in this title for a reason because I want to talk more broadly about us as a society and the way we um discuss women's bodies. Now, Ariana Grande recently had released a music video for her newest album, Petal, that had some very controversial um, moments in it, particularly by one scene, and I'm not going to depict it here. And her physique is of concern, right? She is. I'm trying not to emotionally discuss her body, but anyone with a history of eating disorders or knows someone with eating disorders know that that was a very triggering image. Post that music video, Ariana Grande has stepped out of the spotlight. She has withdrawn from being a part of the Sundays in the park with George. I wanted to talk not just about Ariana Grande, but the overall kind of state of the way we talk about women's bodies. And my frustration is everyone is acting like this is a conversation we're not having when this is a conversation we're always having. And what I mean by this is that it is not wrong to see the physical changes that a celebrity has gone through and find yourself with a visceral reaction. But that visceral reaction, whether or not you need to post it, whether or not you need to make it known, is a completely different story, right? And what we've seen, especially with Ariana, not just within her current tour cycle, but also with the album, kind of started much kind of started at the Wicked press tour with Cynthia Erivo. Need to understand about these situations is that this is a conversation that we're consistently having. We're consistently publicly having these conversations. Our capacity to politely talk about eating disorders and also talk about them with nuance is limited. A lot of people are not healthcare professionals, I myself included, am not someone who works with eating disorders, right? I'm a person who has had their own bouts of physical body image issues as a teenager. I can recognize when there is, need for concern, but ultimately my personal experience does not dictate what any of these celebrities do. Often, and especially because it is imperfect and it is sometimes mocking, it is not necessarily like productive. Um, a lot of this is just body shaming, right? And I think we can walk the lines with nuance of understanding that public figures do have sway on the culture, even though I don't necessarily believe that it's Ariana's like moral duty to be a perfect role model. But it is the fact that her actions, and not just her actions, but the current state of Hollywood and entertainment, and even we can go further with like global entertainment with K-pop as well. All of these people who make the collective conventional beauty standard of the day. Just maybe in the 2010s, we saw bodies that were a little bit more curvy, obviously curvy in the right places, right? Um, and now we're seeing a swing back to thinness. We're seeing a swing back to thinness. We're seeing a lot of these celebrities are abusing GLP-1s. We're seeing kind of this pushback to the proposed body diversity that we had kind of in the 2010s. We need to understand that you can be empathetic, but you can also want a healthier society where we're all trying to curb potentially dangerous behaviors, potentially dangerous ideas about the body, right? And this is kind of my frustration is the way that people act as though we have not discussed thinness at length, that we haven't discussed women's bodies at length. I think about kind of the reception of Lizzo and Megan the Trainer after their weight losses, like particularly for Megan Trainer, where she has kind of gone on more of a fitness route as she's become a mother. Regardless of how you feel about their music, we can understand that a lot of it comes down to their public reception being almost like a punishment for them and their previous physiques. When it came to Megan the Trainer's All About That Bass, people already had kind of negative feelings towards that. One, a lot of people felt, she was kind of more in between. Like, she wasn't a very large woman in comparison to a lot of other women. And at least by, like, Hollywood beauty standards, she was considered fat. But for the average person, she was considered, well, average. And I think that in retrospect, had done quite a bit to shape the way I think people perceive her now, regardless of how you feel about her music. I think there's a lot of people's public perception of her being skewed in almost like a punishing way for her to be pro body positivity and then lose weight, right? And we can acknowledge that you could probably like your body at different sizes and different shapes, but also understand that maybe the body that you had before might not be as serviceable to you today. And I think this is my kind of frustration with the public, like the way things occur in the public square. It feels like people are just trying to get dunks or say the most shocking things or really do something under the guise of a stan war. And I think a lot of this is very unproductive because it really doesn't matter if it's not your fave or if it is your fave. A lot of times, the way we discuss celebrities in general is imperfect, whether it be their mental health, like Lil Nas X, like Britney Spears, like Wendy Williams, whether it be their physical health, any physical changes, or comparisons of bodies. When I think about, like, say, Renee Rapp, when she was Regina George, I think the way people handle these conversations is it's worrisome. I don't think it's necessarily wrong to have an initial gut reaction, particularly if you have suffered from an eating disorder before, when you see a body that potentially mirrors or potentially reminds you of what has harmed you from before, right? I don't think there's anything wrong with hearing the rhetoric or the way that Ariana Grande talks about her own body as something that reminds you of your own physical struggles or your own mental struggles. And you can recognize these things, especially if you've been in that position before, that public figures aren't going to be very reachable because, again, the public will say nasty things to her when she's in quote-unquote healthy weight ranges, whether or not she's quote-unquote unhealthy as well. And I struggle with discussing this topic because I think it requires a lot of nuance of which the general public is just not prepared, right? Because the way that we police women's bodies and the way we set them up for these irresponsible and unattainable standards, right? Whether it be, oh, XYZ celebrity looks like she hasn't aged a day, but also XYZ celebrity can't act anymore because her face is frozen, right? These are in contradiction with themselves, right? Do you want her to look like she has aged, or do you want her to be able to use all of her micro expressions? And it's one of those things where it is a very damned if you do versus damned if you don't. We can acknowledge that if a celebrity was at healthy weight, right, or an average looking physique, they would still be scrutinized, right? Like, the idea of a celebrity is always aspirational. And that can be very dangerous because, you know, they go for procedures or they go for things that are physically unattainable to the rest of us. And then they can reverse that very quickly, right? I think about the way that people use the Kardashians as a temperature check for physical appearance. And what does that say about us as a society where, okay, like, we use a particular family and the trends that they have in their medical procedures and their lifestyle habits as aspirational. It is human to have visceral reactions to very drastic changes within the body. It is even human to look at certain physiques or certain states of being and have a visceral reaction. It is not good to be a person who allows those gut reactions to inform you of the ways you ought to treat people. And so I think we need to have a conversation about using people's bodies, like talking about celebrities through the lens of stan culture. Is you can support someone and acknowledge that they are a complex individual that has the capacity to do harm, right? Do I think Ariana Grande intentionally sets out to do harm? No. I think she is someone who is preoccupied with her own mental health, and she ought to be around people who sincerely want her to be healthy. If you have not dealt with an eating disorder before, you would not understand that these types of comments that imply frailty, imply a level of gauntness that is quote unquote concerning, right? These can often feel like compliments. And that doesn't make sense to people who don't have a mental/eating disorder, but that is what it feels like. And these comments can be incredibly dangerous because they're self-reinforcing. I think there's more nuance that ought to be have about the subject, but I am nervous that within the way I can understand how to speak about it, that I might be also contributing to harm, right? And I think this is something that a lot of people who are making videos, articles, tweets are not thinking about. You know, I think a lot of people are trying to put out their biggest reactions, not for good, like not for a good commentary or a empathetic position, but rather to body shame and to gawk at. I think when I look at all the YouTube videos that plaster her face everywhere, or hell, just like the way everybody is acting like it's like some sort of secret. Like no one has ever had these takes on a woman's body before. It's deeply disturbing to me, I think, as someone who has dealt with an eating disorder. I think what bothers me most about the way we talk about particularly those with EDs is that there is a level of shaming that almost feels like dehumanization. Like how could you even get to that point? And we see this also in the other direction with the way that people perceive fatness as well, where there is this idea that people don't know is less about actual empathy. It is about cruelty. It is about establishing who you find as attractive more so than their health. Because you can say, oh, I wish XYZ person was healthier. I'm just caring about their health. But if all you ever talk about is their physique, is, you know, whether or not they look good to you, rather than say if they're lethargic, if they're having joint pain, if they're you know, physically unable to do certain tasks, then yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to people pretending that their gawking is the same thing as wanting the best for someone. And you know, I think it has been a long time coming for her to be out of the public eye. Why we are so emotionally invested in what, again, particularly women, but not always women, do with their bodies. You know, it's always a trend of, oh, XYZ person looks good, and then once, say, I don't know, plastic, like the certain procedure, like a buccal fat removal, is out of vogue, now it's like, oh, they look weird. We ought to also understand we're not able to change what these women do, but the discourse is for who these women affect. When I think about, say, like plastic surgery in Korea, where, you know, plastic surgery is given as a gift for teenagers, that's concerning, right? And we can have these conversations not to shame in particular parents, but rather look at that society as a whole and say, having a society so focused on physical appearances is unhealthy. And a lot of the way we talk about these eating disorders or physical appearance often comes down to moralizing it as a failure of the individual, rather than looking at it as, say, either in many scenarios, a mental illness, in, you know, when we can go in the opposite direction with obesity and maybe coping mechanisms, food drive, and a whole bunch of other factors. Bodies aren't just individual static symbols of whether or not you're a good person or a bad person. Your body's allowed to change. And we also can acknowledge that when your body is when you are a public figure and your body is something that can be seen as aspirational, we ought to make sure that we don't equate this with morality, right? Because we can understand having physiques that are harmful as aspirational, whether it be absurd amount of surgery to the point where it might become an addiction is bad. We can also acknowledge rapid weight loss can be bad, even with or without GLP-1s. We can understand that come from a level of objectification and moralization of whether or not a woman is a good person. There is still this equation of beauty being goodness that I think plays a role in how we perceive these bodies. Cannot change the fact that people do have gut reactions to what they see. You can, however, choose whether or not you post those gut reactions, whether you unpack why you feel that way, and whether or not you can discuss something in a productive way, and whether or not we can talk about something and frame something not as a moral failure of an individual, not as a demonization of an individual, but rather as a broader and construct. And we can also acknowledge all these celebrities can still perpetuate harm and can still reinforce very dangerous ideas of beauty or health, right? Because there are structural reasons for why someone is unhealthy or healthy. And this includes celebrities. It includes the way we have equated beauty with health. It includes the way we equate thinness with health. And so I think we need to understand as the public that sometimes we can have natural reactions to something and not have them be the first thing we post out there, and understand that sometimes the way we talk about things is not productive nor warranted. And I'm trying to do a very nuanced take because we also need to acknowledge that at the end of the day, it's not just her mental health. It is anyone who could potentially relapse. It is anyone who could potentially have their own mental health being affected by seeing these images. We need to have an empathetic view, acknowledge the fact that she is still responsible for her platform as a celebrity, understand that your concern may not change her behavior because she is an autonomous adult who does not know you, right? And these things I think are very difficult because it is the public reaction that leads people to not be open about EDs. And in fact, in general, when it comes to mental health or even physical health, when it comes to disabilities, we are not socially equipped as a society to discuss these things with nuance and grace that it deserves. And I think that if there's anything, I hope things trend in better directions for her health. But as someone who has been in a much more dangerous position, I see a lot of it reflected. I worry. I think we can have mature conversations that do not lead to shame or moralizing of one's body. We, as a society, especially as, say, other women who have dealt with our own battles of body images, can hopefully provide nuanced takes that allow for other generations to have more guidance in approaching their health in ways that aren't as damaging as we've seen in the past. This one was kind of a heavy one, and I am trying my best to speak on these subjects without blaming her or blaming any in particular celebrity. Again, this is a social and structural issue as a whole. It is something that has been baked into our society for a long time. And I'm sick of people acting like we don't talk about women's bodies when they seem to be something that we talk about all the fucking time. Okay, hopefully this made sense. And hopefully it was empathetic and graceful.